Three generations of Marines stood at Morrison's range that morning. The young recruits fresh from Parris Island, full of pride and swagger. The NCOs with multiple deployments under their belts. And the quiet old man in Lane 7 who had been fighting America's wars before any of them were born. What the younger Marines didn't know was that they were about to meet a legend. Welcome to Silent Legends. Before we dive into this story of respect, recognition, and the bonds that connect Marines across generations, tell me in the comments which state you're watching from today. And if you believe stories like this remind us why we honor our veterans, hit that subscribe button. Morrison's shooting range opened at 8 a.m. sharp, but Frank Castillo had been waiting in the parking lot since 7:45. He always arrived early, not because he was eager, but because old habits from Force Recon died hard. Perimeter security, situational awareness, advanced preparation. These weren't just military concepts to Frank. They were survival instincts that had kept him alive in places where the jungle had more eyes than a man could count. Frank was 74 years old, with silver hair that he kept military short and hands that showed the wear of 7 decades. He wore the same outfit every Tuesday, faded Levi's, a plain white t-shirt, and a worn baseball cap with no insignia. Nothing about his appearance suggested military service. No patches, no unit identifiers, no proud veteran declarations. Just a quiet man who looked like any other retiree with time to fill. He signed in at the front desk with deliberate handwriting, paying for Lane 7 with exact change. Always Lane 7. Farthest from the entrance, best sight lines to all approaches, position where he could observe without being observed. The range staff knew him as a regular, reliable, polite. He never caused problems, never complained, never engaged in the loud conversations that fill the air between shots. Frank's gear was minimal. A single pistol case containing a well-maintained Colt 1911, 3 magazines, and exactly 30 rounds of .45 ACP ammunition. No fancy accessories, no tactical equipment, just the basics. He set up with the same methodical precision he had used to prepare for reconnaissance missions 45 years earlier. The morning routine never varied. Check the weapon, load 1 magazine, place the others within easy reach. Pin a standard silhouette target at 25 yards. Take a shooting stance that instructors at Quantico would have recognized as textbook, even if it looked old-fashioned to younger shooters who had learned from YouTube videos and tactical training courses. Frank's first shot always went exactly where he intended. Center mass, clean hole, no wasted motion. He would pause after each shot, not from fatigue, but from discipline. In Vietnam, ammunition was precious, and every round had to count. Some habits were worth keeping. On this particular Tuesday morning, Frank wasn't alone. A group of 6 Marines had arrived for unit training. Young men in their early 20s who carried themselves with the confidence that comes from completing the crucible at Parris Island and surviving the rigors of infantry training. They were loud, energetic, competitive. Everything Frank had once been. Before the jungle taught him the value of silence, the Marines claimed lanes 3 through 5, directly across from Frank's position. As they set up their equipment, their conversation carried across the range. Talk of deployments, training exercises, weekend plans. The casual banter of young warriors who had not yet learned that some experiences were too heavy for words. Lance Corporal Rodriguez was the first to notice the old man. "Check out Grandpa over there," he said, loud enough for his squad to hear, but not quite loud enough to carry to Lane 7. "Look at that stance. Straight out of World War II. The others looked over and chuckled. Frank's shooting position was indeed old school. Feet planted, body squared to the target. Classic isosceles stance that modern tactical training had largely replaced with more dynamic approaches. To the young Marines, it looked outdated, inefficient. Probably learned to shoot in Korea, laughed Private Martinez. Bet he thinks that .45 is still the ultimate combat pistol. Staff Sergeant Torres, the senior NCO in the group, said nothing. He was older than the others, 32, with 3 deployments to Afghanistan under his belt. Torres had seen enough combat to recognize something the younger Marines missed. The way the old man moved wasn't outdated. It was precise, controlled. The kind of precision that came from years of practice under conditions where mistakes had consequences. Frank heard the comments but didn't react. He had been called worse things by better men. Instead, he focused on his shooting, placing each round with the kind of accuracy that only came from decades of practice. His groupings were tight, consistent, professional. Not the scattered patterns of a weekend hobbyist, but the controlled precision of someone who had once depended on marksmanship for survival. After 20 minutes of shooting, Frank began his reloading process. As he reached for a fresh magazine, his t-shirt sleeve rode up slightly, revealing a portion of his left form. Most people wouldn't have noticed, but Staff Sergeant Torres had been trained to observe details. What he saw made him freeze mid-conversation. A tattoo, faded with age but still visible to someone who knew what to look for. Not an amateur design from a parlor, but military ink. Professional work that spoke of unit pride and brotherhood. Torres could make out part of what looked like wings, crossed rifles, and numbers that meant something specific to anyone who understood Marine Corps history. Torres stepped closer, pretending to adjust his own equipment while stealing glances at the old man's arm. When Frank turned slightly to check his target, Torres saw enough to make his heart race. Force Recon insignia, the elite reconnaissance unit that had operated deep behind enemy lines in Vietnam. The kind of unit that most Marines had heard about but few had served with. "Holy shit," Torres whispered, using language that would have earned him extra duty under normal circumstances. The younger Marines looked at him with confusion. "What's wrong, Staff Sergeant?" Torres didn't answer immediately. He was processing what he had seen, trying to match the quiet old man in Lane 7 with the elite warriors he had read about in Marine Corps history. Force Recon Marines were legends in the Corps. Small teams that had operated for weeks behind enemy lines, gathering intelligence and conducting operations that officially never happened. Frank finished his magazine and began the slow process of cleaning his weapon. As he worked, more of his forearm became visible. Torres could now see the full tattoo, Force Recon wings, crossed rifles, and beneath them, numbers that indicated tour dates. 1968 to 1970, the height of the Vietnam War, when Force Recon teams were conducting some of the most dangerous missions in Marine Corps history. Torres made a decision. He walked over to Lane 7, his demeanor completely different from the casual confidence he had shown earlier. When he spoke, his voice carried the respect that one Marine shows another, regardless of rank or age. "Excuse me, sir. I couldn't help but notice your ink." Frank looked up from his weapon cleaning, meeting Torres' eyes directly. No hostility, no defensiveness, just the calm assessment of a man who had been approached by strangers in much more dangerous circumstances. "Force Recon," Torres said simply. "Vietnam." Frank nodded once. "Long time ago." "Not that long ago, sir. Some things don't change." The conversation had caught the attention of the younger Marines, who stopped their own shooting to observe. Something in Staff Sergeant Torres' tone told them this wasn't a casual interaction. "What unit, if you don't mind me asking?" Torres continued. "Third Force," Frank replied. "Operated out of Da Nang, mostly. Some other places that weren't supposed to exist." Torres felt a chill run down his spine. 3rd Force Reconnaissance Company had been one of the most decorated units in Vietnam, conducting deep reconnaissance missions that required weeks behind enemy lines with no support. The casualty rates had been staggering, the missions classified for decades. How many tiers? Torres asked. 2 official, Frank said, then paused. Some other work that wasn't officially tours. The younger Marines were beginning to understand that something significant was happening. Lance Corporal Rodriguez, who had made the jokes about outdated techniques, stepped closer with obvious uncertainty. Frank continued cleaning his weapon with the same methodical precision, but now Torres could see it differently. This wasn't the slow movement of an elderly hobbyist. This was the practiced efficiency of someone who had cleaned weapons in jungle bases where a malfunction could mean death for an entire team. "Sir," Torres said, "my men were wondering about your shooting stance." Frank looked up again, this time letting his eyes sweep across the group of young Marines. He could see the curiosity, the dawning respect, the uncertainty of young warriors meeting an old one. "Old school," Frank said simply. "Before they taught movement and cover, we learned to shoot straight first, move second. In the jungle," Torres said, understanding. "In the jungle, you might get one shot," Frank confirmed. "Better make it count." Rodriguez cleared his throat nervously. "So, I apologize for the comments earlier. We didn't know." Frank studied the young Marine for a moment, then nodded. "Nothing to apologize for, son. You're doing what Marines do. Talking tough, shooting straight, watching each other's backs. Same as we did." But Torres wasn't ready to let the moment pass. "So, would you mind if I asked about your missions?" Frank was quiet for a long moment, considering. Most of his operations remained classified, even 40 years later. Teams inserted by helicopter into enemy territory, spending weeks gathering intelligence, conducting reconnaissance, and occasionally eliminating high-value targets. Work that officially never happened, performed by men whose names never appeared in the newspapers. "We went places other Marines couldn't go," Frank said finally. "Small teams, long missions, no backup. Do what needed to be done and came home when we could." The simplicity of the statement carried more weight than any detailed war story. Torres understood that Frank was describing missions that had required skills and courage that most people couldn't comprehend. Small unit operations behind enemy lines, where survival depended on individual competence and team cohesion. "How many men in your teams?" Private Martinez asked. 4 to 6, usually. Sometimes fewer coming back. The silence that followed was heavy with implication. Force Recon had suffered casualty rates that were classified for decades. Losses that spoke to the danger of their missions and the courage of the men who accepted them. Frank finished cleaning his weapon and began packing his gear. As he worked, Torres noticed other details that spoke of military training. The way Frank organized his equipment, the systematic approach to securing his gear, the automatic scan of his surroundings before standing. Small habits that revealed a lifetime of military discipline. "So," Torres said, "would you consider joining us for coffee after the range? My men could learn a lot from someone with your experience." Frank considered the invitation. For 3 years, he had come to this range alone, shot his 30 rounds, and left without meaningful conversation with anyone. The isolation had been intentional, a way of keeping the past separate from the present. But looking at these young Marines, he saw something that reminded him of his own youth, his own pride in service, his own need for connection with others who understood what military service meant. "Coffee sounds good," Frank said. An hour later, 6 Marines sat around a table at a nearby diner, listening to Frank Castillo share stories that textbooks couldn't capture. Not war stories in the traditional sense, but insights into leadership, brotherhood, and the weight of carrying responsibilities that most people never face. He talked about the importance of precision under pressure, the value of trusting your teammates, and the reality that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. He shared lessons learned in circumstances that none of them would ever face, but principles that applied to any Marine serving in any era. The young Marines listened with the kind of attention they usually reserve for their commanding officers. Not because Frank outranked them, but because he represented something they aspired to become. A Marine who had served with honor, carried his experiences with dignity, and remained committed to the values that defined their core. When the conversation ended, Torres walked Frank to his car. "So, thank you for sharing your time with us. My Marines needed to hear what you had to say." Frank nodded. "They're good kids. Remind me of some people I used to know. Will we see you at the range next Tuesday? Same time, same lane." Frank confirmed that as Frank drove away, Torres rejoined his Marines. The conversation had changed them, all of them. Rodriguez, who had made jokes about outdated techniques, was already planning to research Force Recon history. Martinez was thinking about the courage required to volunteer for missions with such high casualty rates. The others were processing their own responses to meeting a living piece of Marine Corps legend. The next Tuesday, when Frank arrived at Morrison's range, he found lane 7 empty as usual. But lanes 3 through 5 were occupied by 6 Marines who nodded respectfully as he passed. No jokes about old-fashioned techniques. No comments about outdated equipment. Just the quiet acknowledgement that passes between Marines who recognize each other as brothers in arms. Frank's shooting routine remained the same. 30 rounds, precise groupings, methodical weapon maintenance. But the atmosphere had changed. The young Marines watched him with respect, learning from his example, understanding that military excellence transcended generations. Sometimes Torres would approach after shooting to ask questions about leadership or tactics. The conversations were brief but meaningful, connections between past and present that honored the continuity of Marine Corps values. Frank found himself looking forward to these interactions, remembering what it felt like to be part of something larger than himself. The range had become more than a place to maintain marksmanship skills. It had become a bridge between generations of Marines, a place where experience was shared and respect was earned through demonstrated competence rather than proclaimed credentials. Frank Castillo never sought recognition for his service. His decorations remained in a box at home. His war stories stayed private. His sacrifices went unmentioned. But every Tuesday morning, at Morrison's range, he continued to serve in his own way, teaching by example, sharing through presence, reminding young Marines that the values they had sworn to uphold were worth carrying for a lifetime. So I ask you, have you ever met a veteran whose quiet dignity spoke louder than any war story? Someone whose presence reminded you that heroism doesn't always announce itself. Share their story in the comments, because here at Silent Legends, we believe that the most powerful lessons are often taught by those who never intended to become teachers. Thank you for watching. If Frank's story moved you, please subscribe and share this video. Help us honor the veterans who continue to serve through their example, who carry their experiences with grace, and who remind us that the bonds forged in service transcend time and generation. Until next time, remember, respect is earned through actions, not words. And sometimes the quietest voices carry the most important messages.